Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Grandmother. Camille asked my grandmother again, but there must be some mistake. My grandmother died a long time ago. The voice on the phone was impassively dry. There is no mistake. Emily is indeed your paternal great-aunt, though not by blood. Your great-uncle Stephen was her spouse. However, he passed away more than 15 years ago. Thus, Emily was left alone. She has no other relatives but you. So that's how the girl muttered. And how am I supposed to see her? Write down the address. Camille hurriedly found a notebook and a pencil. What did she suddenly ask the hospice? My relative is in a hospice. I'm afraid so. Camille, we wish you could see your grandmother before she passes away. She's dying. What's wrong with her? Old age. Dear Camille, only old age. Hurry. In Emily's case, the end could come at any moment. The hospice was located in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by a huge park. The white building stood out brightly among the densely planted trees. Some patients walked through the alleys on their own. Others were wheeled in gurney chairs by smiling young men in light-colored uniforms. Some walked on crutches, and these too were followed by men in blonde uniforms. They were talking softly about something, laughing with their charges, but really making sure that no one stumbled when they suddenly lost their balance, that no wheelchair was knocked over by a root sticking out of the ground. They must have been orderlies or Camille's nurses. For some reason I thought they looked like angels. That's how they protect the people entrusted to their care. A middle-aged nurse was already waiting at the gate of the hospice. A woman with a kind face and an affectionate voice touched her arm. Before you see Emily, there are a few things I need to tell you. First of all, you need to know that your relative, well, you know, at her age I don't know anything about her age. Camille interrupted. I didn't know I had any relatives at all. My parents died before I was 5 years old. I grew up with my grandmother, my mother's mother, but she was gone when I was 14. Then the orphanage. Then the nurse sighed. Would you rather talk to her, doctor? Let me walk you out. He'll tell you the whole story. The doctor was sitting at his desk, leafing through someone's chart. And now and then he pushed his glasses up to his forehead to wipe his eyes on the nurse. He barely glanced up. I'm busy, Evelyn. Anything urgent for you? The visitor is a relative of our Emily's. The nurse looked around and gestured for Camille to come in. Thank you, Evelyn. You can leave us. I'll tell you all about it. The nurse went out quietly, and the girl was left standing in front of the unfamiliar doctor. And he was in no hurry to introduce himself, carefully studying the girl, putting his elbows on the table and resting his chin on the interlaced fingers. Under his gaze, Camille felt like a guinea pig. The doctor stared at her silently, as if he wondered what she would do now. He waited for a reaction to his inaction. The girl came closer and sat down in the visitor's chair. You did not offer me a seat, she said, and smiled broadly. So I myself do not mind. The doctor grinned. Anyway, their prolonged silence was interrupted. The reaction he received was unclear whether he was satisfied with it or not. So you, Camille, said the doctor. Frankly, I did not expect you to come after all. Camille looked at the sad, tired man and could not understand whether he was reproaching her or he was just thinking out loud. I got the call, she said. I came. I didn't know anything about having relatives. Well, Camille, said the doctor, getting comfortable. We have a long talk ahead of us. He took off his glasses and blinked a few times quickly. I'm sorry. This is the second day I've been on duty. There's no one to do the work, you know. You know, it's like when a man gets a job here, and a month later the other one writes his resignation letter. They don't pay enough. Camille asked sympathetically. The doctor grinned. No, they pay just fine here. But we're not an ordinary hospital either. Yes, that's right. In an ordinary hospital people get well. The doctor went on. In a hospice they come to die. Not everybody can stand working in a place like that. It's a serious challenge to the human psyche. Would you like some coffee? I was just going to get some. I could get you some. I won't say no, she nodded. By the way, I don't know your name. My name is Christopher. Do you like cookies? I do. On the table immediately appeared a box to the top, filled with thin, lacy cookies, candies, and dried orange circles. A little weakness of the local staff, Christopher smiled as he placed a cup of coffee in front of the girl. We're all very fond of sweets here. And you know, it's no accident. I've already told you that our job isn't easy, even for doctors. Although it's believed that our professional cynicism saves us, but we are also human beings and often worry about the sick. And sweets affect the so-called pleasure center in the brain. Helps to reduce stress. Comforting. Although, of course, it is harmful. I also buy sweets when I'm in a bad mood, Camille confessed. Candy, chocolate. For some reason it helps. She couldn't help but wonder if that nice, tired doctor wasn't just talking to her on distracted topics. He did not look like a talker. Rather, he was trying to connect with her, get her to relax and start trusting him. He must be doing it for something. Why, I wonder. Sooner or later I'll find out, said the girl to herself. She took a cookie and put it next to her cup. There you go, Christopher said, sipping his coffee with pleasure. Let's go back to Emily. So you don't know much about her? Camille shook her head negatively. Nothing. I don't know anything. Then it's more difficult. The thing is, we're kind of at a loss ourselves. Emily has spent the last few years in a nursing home. A series of tragic accidents led to this. Emily had no children or any other family to take care of her. And fraudsters took advantage of that. People of the older generation, especially the lonely ones, they are often naive, socially isolated, and all that. Eventually, the poor woman lost her home and ended up in an almshouse. Where? Camille clarified. Let's call it that. With a little pressure in his voice, Christopher asked. The conditions were not ideal. We think it made the old man's sanity even worse. But just a week ago, something amazing happened. A certain anonymous benefactor paid for Emily's stay here, and that doesn't come cheap. Of course, he knew he wouldn't be staying with this patient for long. Otherwise, he would have chosen another boarding school for her. But he made inquiries about her family and got in touch with you. That wasn't easy, either. Your trail had been lost since you ended up in the orphanage. I see. And here she is. You can imagine how unusual this patient is. People who come here are paid for by relatives or benefactors, but the latter try not to stay in the shadows. And this is a total unknown. If you think I know the name of this mysterious benefactor of the early Camille, I'm afraid I don't, do I? The doctor reassured her. I'm just telling you the story of your relative. Though I'm afraid the real story is known only to her. So, let's continue. The second unusual circumstance. Emily often talks in her sleep. Apparently, she has recurring dreams. And in her dreams, she repeats the same thing. Her husband's name, the girl probably assumed. No, Camille. She's talking about someone she calls John. It's a German name, as I'm sure you know. It's hardly one of her neighbors or friends. You mean she's dreaming of a German? You see, the age matches. The war caught her as a very young girl. It could all be written off as traumatic memories. But the speech she makes to this John, you must agree, is strange, to address the enemy gently. Don't you think? Listen to this. Camille, suddenly angry. You yourself said she was not herself. So why think about what a crazy old woman dreams about? Besides, what makes you think John was necessarily a soldier? It could have been anyone. A beloved dog, for example. Dogs are usually given foreign names like Kurt Guy John. Maybe she had a dog. But in that case, she wouldn't have spoken German to the dog. The doctor laid out his trump card. Smile, the girl thought, looking at the strange expression on the doctor's face. What a strange smile he had, as if he had forgotten to put it on his face. He had forgotten, and his lips are smiling. It's just the lips that are so ridiculous, and the look is hard like armor. And the third oddity I have to tell you about, Christopher continued. As if nothing had happened, Emily brought some photo albums with her. She's probably very attached to them. There's nothing much in them. The usual life chronicles. Lots of pictures of her spouse from birth to death, a wedding photo. But pictures of herself. I mean her life. There are no pictures of her parents before her marriage at all. That's pretty unusual too, isn't it? But if the war caught my relative, a young girl, then it turns out she was born in her early to mid-20s at most. Photo shoots weren't as popular then as they are now, but people usually still had pictures of themselves. There was a soft but palpable pressure in the doctor's voice again. Even those who have to flee from war. And Emily. "And what do you want from me?" Abruptly, the doctor asked Camille, shrugging his shoulders. "Just to let you know, I have no idea if you can be friends with your grandmother. But maybe it is you who can help shed some light on her past. Perhaps she has some relatives in Germany or friends who might remember her." "Why would you want to do that?" asked Camille warily. She did not like this conversation. This doctor is hiding something. The old woman, he said, would not last long. And with her mind gone mad too. But she's paid for. Then why the search for the relatives of his friends? He doesn't expect them to take her away or bring her back to her senses. Then what's the point? Christopher rubbed the bridge of his nose again. You see, Camille, lonely old age. It's a terrible thing. When there's no one else around to witness your past, you begin to doubt whether it ever happened or not. For many it serves, well, a kind of impetus to the development of mental illness. If only it were possible to find someone who remembers Emily. Be glad, Camille, that you don't know what it's like to be alone in your old age. At least I know you're lying, thought the girl. I just don't understand why. When am I going to see her? Dryly she asked. The doctor smiled, this time quite sincerely. Of course you can right now. I will take you to her myself. He stood up and politely opened the door in front of Camille. She hardly speaks, Christopher warned, stopping in front of the old lady's room. Try to make eye contact with her first, and take your time. It takes a lot of patience with patients like that. I'll try, shrugged the girl. Good afternoon, Emily, the doctor said with an exaggeratedly friendly manner, and was the first to enter the room. Gray-haired little old lady sitting by the window did not even turn around at his voice. How are we feeling today? Christopher approached his patient with the same benevolent smile, but got no answer. I see we are not in a good mood. But that's all right. Look who I brought you. It's your great-uncle who came to visit you. Camille stood in the doorway, hesitating to come any closer. Well, you talk cheerfully, said the doctor, and I won't disturb you. He looked embarrassed, as if indifferent. The old woman offended him. Maybe he felt embarrassed that the sick woman did not even look at him. The doctor walked out with evident relief and closed the door behind him. Camille, taking her time, walked to the window where Emily was staring. There the green park, emerald wormwood, the colors, bottle glass marsh, green, and even blue, stretched wide out there below. All the hues were there, perhaps. One could actually stare at them for a very long time. For a minute Camille stared into this profusion of hues. The old woman did not move. Her gaze was quite blank. They say about such eyes, the light is on, and there is nobody at home. Maybe we should open a window, Camille suggested. Let's get some fresh air. It's too stuffy in here. Even a healthy person would go crazy. Nothing was said to her, but Camille was ready to swear that the corners of the old lady's lips twitched in a smile. The freshest rush of air rushed into the room. Camille inhaled it with pleasure. Emily, as she noticed, also began to breathe a little deeper, though she tried to do it as inconspicuously as possible. So she too was stuffy. I see that you and I are alike, the girl said softly, not looking at her relative. I am as stubborn as you are. If I don't want to talk, no one will get a word out of me, but I will not insist. Let's be silent together. That too is true communication. She finally turned to the old woman, about to wink at her, and as if with all her might tripped over a stone. The old watery blue eyes looked at her carefully and sternly. You can't fool me, Camille thought. There is nothing wrong with your head. You only pretend to be out of your mind, but you know better than most. I'm sick of that fool, Christopher, said the old woman, distinctly, with her idiotic smiles and her mooling. With curiosity, she thought she was smarter than the others with a wink, and it immediately made the girl seem 20 years younger, if not more. Idiot. Grandmother, shocked, mouthed Camille, but against her will, could not keep from smiling. What are you talking about? I'm telling the truth. Old age is, by the way, a great luxury. I've waited a long time to live it. You'd better look out the door. That jerk is definitely gone. Camille tiptoed to the exit, looked out into the hallway, and then closed the door and came back clear. She reported back, I looked everywhere. Finally, Emily got up from her chair and stretched herself to the point of crunching with pleasure. You can't imagine how much effort it takes sometimes just to be left alone. Grandmother began to Camille carefully. This doctor told me that you were babbling in German in your sleep calling for some John. And he was pestering me about it too. Who's John? Who's John? Quite similar, she imitated Christopher's way of speaking. I told him it was Remarque, John Maria Remarque, and that I'd read it in the original. Damn it. Lied understandingly, smirked Camille. Of course, the old woman even spluttered with indignation. Why do I have to answer to this guy? He's always sticking his big nose in everything. Although Remarque in the original I did read, but that's no one's business. Listen, she suddenly said, I do not like to talk. Here all the time it seems that someone is going to come in. I think it's better if we go for a walk in the park. Do you mind? Are you hesitant? The girl asked. It's not forbidden. Everyone is allowed to do anything here. Emily chuckled nonchalantly. But we'll take a wheelbarrow as a diversion. You can drive me around the alley, and I'll pretend I'm a senile old woman. I can do that. Let's go. The weather's nice today. The weather was fine indeed. A gentle breeze played with the leaves on the trees. The sun was shining so softly, as if it wanted to warm everyone. After a too long, cold winter, Camille wandered the alleys, and then stealthily turned deeper into the park. The alleys there were narrower only for walkers, but there were cozy benches every couple of meters. Do you want to go for a walk, Grandma? Camille asked. You won't be seen here, and if someone turns around, you can sit in a chair. I'll walk beside you. Yes, I think so, Emily answered later. Why don't you sit on the bench? Rest. She sat down, obediently. She had trouble making sense of all she had seen and heard today. But one thing was certain, this new grandmother of hers would not make her feel bored. It was also clear that the old woman liked her for some reason, but in order not to spoil the budding trust between them, there was no hurry. So Camille was silent, pretending to admire the park. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see her grandmother watching her closely, but she didn't show it. You must be impatient to hear it, mustn't you? She asked the old woman. What was Camille's confusion about John? German and all that? Don't pretend you're not curious. Not very sincerely, answered the girl. Everyone is entitled to their secrets. Really, secrets are secrets, grumbled Emily. Secrets are usually scary, or at least unpleasant, but no one knows how they weigh on the soul before death. Repentance, they say, allows one to receive forgiveness from God. I don't know, but confession eases the soul. That's true. And maybe they let a man go in peace. Camille smiled. Well, you say, grandmother, with your brains. It's too early to think about death. And yet, I'm about to be 99 years old, sternly interrupted her old lady. And anyone who still has at least a shred of sense understands that at this age death is already breathing in the back. My husband told me this a long time ago. Before his own death, my great-uncle told Camille. Why didn't I know anything about him? The truth is, I didn't even catch my grandfather alive. But my grandmother didn't tell me we had any other relatives. I didn't know Grandpa had a brother. Your grandmother might not have known. The old woman sighed. The brothers had quarreled a long time ago. It happened because of me. Camille looked at Emily curiously. They were both in love with you. But the old woman shook her head. No, Camille, it was much simpler than that, but also more complicated. Well, I see there's a nurse already rushing over there to take me back. Come back in a week. We'll talk more. You'll also find some photo albums in my room. You can keep them. I may not live to see another week, so you better take them now. When the nurse approached Camille and Emily, the old woman's face instantly lost all expression. The look became meaningless. Her head was cute, shaking. She hummed something of Emily's nursery rhyme. Time for dinner, smiled the lovely Evelyn, who had greeted Camille at the gate. I think that's enough for a first visit. She gets tired very quickly. She mustn't get excited. You can visit her again in a week. Camille remembered Camille's grandmother's request. I think I left my bag in her room. May I take it back? Absolutely, nodded Evelyn. Don't worry, I'll take your grandmother back to the ward myself. Emily's albums. Fortunately, they were small in size and fit nicely in a small bag. No one noticed that she took them with her. At home, Camille had a cold stove and an empty refrigerator waiting. Robert sat in the kitchen. At the sight of the girl, the left corner of his mouth crept down, and his eyebrows rose mockingly. He said with an unkind chuckle, "After all, it's all love. It's all bloody love. What's that got to do with it?" asked the girl, not knowing what she meant. "Because if I didn't love you, what would I have to do with you? So I am a bride. The refrigerator is empty. There's nothing to eat. You could have cooked it yourself," Camille said. "It's okay. What kind of food? You don't have an axe, or at least we could have made porridge, like in a fairy tale. Will you go to the store and buy what you need?" Camille answered her fiancé reluctantly. She was still not let go. Thoughts of her grandmother, of the hospice, of those photo albums she couldn't wait to see. She didn't immediately notice that Robert had been complaining about life for almost a minute. Go out and buy one. Do you think I print the money? I do, and I buy, and I cook. And what will you do, my princess? You'll come to all ready to eat. Honestly, it's like you don't love me at all. It's like you don't care if I'm hungry. I'm hungry. Do I have any money? No. Okay, I'll go by myself. The girl interrupted him. She knew that if Robert wasn't stopped, he could whine and complain for a very long time. It was a phenomenal ability he'd inherited from his father. He had managed to complain for hours. Absolutely. His record was as much as 10 hours with breaks for food and sleep. Camille once did the math when she had the misfortune to go to Robert's parents' dacha for kebabs in May. Ever since, she had politely declined their invitation. But what could she do about Robert? You can't put a finger on jeans. Where have you been, by the way? The fiancé came to his senses when he realized he couldn't complain enough. I had to go to work. Camille quickly found herself. For some reason, she didn't want to tell Robert anything. At least not now. Maybe afterwards, when she had sorted things out. An orphan is an orphan. Philosophically, he said, no one taught you to stand up for your rights. If you said you had the day off, you wouldn't go anywhere. Did they ever tell you anything about rights at your orphanage? They did. The girl smiled, already inwardly boiling. They said I had the right not to have to listen to the bullshit of a helpless mama's boy who'd been sitting on my neck for 3 weeks. Robert jumped at the injustice, like he was stung. It's not my fault my parents are having construction work done, he shrieked. And you could have had a conscience and not reminded me of it. Did you have Camille yelling at him about having no rights? Or are you also an orphan and not a scholar? You should have gone to your parents and told them that you had to earn something to feed yourself too. That's different. What about it? She answered when she was putting on her shoes. It is always different for you. Out into the street, Camille ran out into the street, seething with anger. Though it wasn't Robert she was most angry with. Even if he was lazy and whiny 3 times over, he couldn't be changed. It was her own pointless patience that irritated her most. Why did she go on living with him? Even she did not know the answer to that question. But suddenly it was clear that now it was time to sort things out. And not just because of another one of their quarrels. It's just this suddenly found a relative with her mysteries. This doctor, who clearly has an interest in this story, but for some reason prefers to keep quiet about it. And all of this has to be sorted out. And now with Robert too. So the time has come for a showdown. She thought to herself, and immediately dismissed the idea. No, a showdown. That sounds kind of gangsterish. Let it be a time of general cleaning in life, she decided. Now that's a title I kind of like. Only now she remembered that she hadn't eaten anything since this morning, had been hanging around this hospice, and hadn't even thought about food. Camille quickly ran across the street and headed for the clear door under the sign of cinnamon and vanilla. The aroma of the bakery was so overpowering that she had to work hard to keep from drooling on the spot. A familiar salesman smiled at the sight of a regular customer. "What's the mood today?" he asked. "Fun. A cinnamon roll and a croissant with buttercream bagel with condensed milk. Or better, something not sweet." "I'm in a hungry mood." Camille exhaled. "Give me that bun, a croissant, and a morsel." She waved at the boy as she took a bite out of the muffin and went back outside. Camille sat down on the first bench she could find and quickly twisted the cap off the morsel bottle. It was the tastiest meal she had ever eaten, she muttered, not paying attention to passersby. Suddenly, she remembered how once in an orphanage there was happiness. A charity shift at a summer camp on the shore of the Black Sea. They didn't get out of the water and bathe 4 times a day. But even that was not enough for them. At night, she and a few others just as desperate would sneak out to the sea. As soon as the counselors fell asleep after the first such outing, they were in for a little surprise. After a swim in the sea, usually a terrible desire to eat, and breakfast was still a long way off. And Camille, along with the others, couldn't sleep from hunger. And she counted the hours until dawn. And when they finally got their breakfast, the half-baked apple pancakes with sour cream were the tastiest meal they had ever eaten. Camille remembered how, just as she had said with her mouth full, she had never tasted better in her life. And no matter what anyone said, it was the absolute truth that everything tasted good to a hungry person. She finished her bun and immediately took a croissant. The morsel bottle was rapidly emptying. "I should take this pastry to my grandmother. When I go to her," she suddenly thought, "of course, the hospice is expensive. They probably do not feed only porridge there. But still it is nice to eat unhealthy goodies." Sometimes the phone in her pocket vibrated, and Camille immediately guessed that it was Robert calling. His calls even the soulless cell phone seemed to hate. For some reason it began to vibrate in a particularly insistent and even irritable way, as if it asked the mistress to answer the call as soon as possible. Well, or at least reset it. Surely he was sitting there waiting for her to bring him something to eat. Camille threw the empty bottle into the trash can in anger. It was sad to admit it, but she was tired of her fiancé. And almost at once, Robert was the kind of suitor who, when he noticed a girl he liked, clung to his victim like a tick. And getting rid of them is a big deal. 5 years ago, Robert saw a pretty blonde Camille at a New Year's Eve party and decided that from now on she, and only she. For Camille, however, his attention became a severe test. Robert never missed a chance to stop by her department. He brought her tea and coffee, and after work he stuck outside to take her home. All the girls' hints that his attention was weighing on her were passed over in his ears. The most frustrating thing was that the mall where they both worked at the time was full of girls who thought Robert was cute. Camille sincerely hoped that at least one of them would be able to turn her insistent beau over to her. But she soon realized for nothing. Robert was notable for his consistency. Never before had Camille thought that could be a disadvantage. But there was consistency. A beautiful thing, but only when it was necessary. One must be able to leave if one must. After a month of Robert's courtship, Camille gradually came to terms with him. She grew accustomed to him, just as she had grown accustomed to the music constantly playing in the sales room, just as she had grown accustomed to the flow of visitors and even to the fluidity of the workplace. Sometimes she even told Robert about what had happened during the day. One day, out of the blue, she invited him over to watch a movie. Actually, she really wanted to see a movie. The weather outside was rainy in the fall, and she felt strangely bored. Camille wanted to watch comedies and laugh with someone. Unfortunately, Robert took her up on her offer and almost immediately moved in on the action. Camille only gave in because she was terribly uncomfortable. She herself had created an ambiguous situation, and now it turned out that she had upset the poor man. Then she often blamed herself for not being more firm. Even though Robert was not good at understanding innuendos of varying degrees of transparency, she could have just told him to go fuck himself. The problem was that Camille had no idea why she could be so rude to a man who was invariably nice, who gave her flowers, bought her candy, was always ready to help her, and smiled even when she was in the worst of moods. Just like that. Just tell him I'm sick of you, so do me a favor. Leave me alone for no reason at all. These words were on her tongue. And so she endured, learning to put up with the presence of this sweet, but tearfully boring man. You cannot hurt people without a reason. And there was no reason. Camille didn't notice how little by little Robert had moved all his things into her apartment and had taken up residence there. Every day she was going to talk to him seriously. But in the evening, when she returned from work, she found fresh flowers in a vase, her favorite cakes in the refrigerator. And of course, Robert, who cheered her on as if he hadn't seen her in a year, rather than saying goodbye to her just this morning. When did he propose to her? Camille accepted it as something inevitable. There was no chance of escaping Robert's web of care and cautiousness. It's dangerous not to get out when you don't. Reasons to twitch are very, very dangerous. And then things began to change little by little, unnoticed. It's just one reproach for not washing the dishes. Maybe it was just an accident. After all, Robert wasn't made of stone. He too has bad days. This rebuke was followed by a second, and then a third. And each time, Robert casually mentioned the fact that his fiancée was from an orphanage and had no one to teach her useful things. I'm not mad at you for not washing your plate right away. There's no one at the orphanage to teach her that. Normal women wash the floors twice a day, even if the orphanage didn't teach you that. It's the orphanage's own way of dressing. Lately, when Robert quit his job to help his parents with the construction of the country house, it became quite unbearable. If you spend all your time at your parents' construction site, let your parents feed you. Camille couldn't stand it one day. Don't you really understand what's going on? We live together, but I'm the only one who pays for everything. And you have the construction of the century. Are you suggesting that I refuse to help my parents? The groom resented me. I am suggesting that you find a compromise between helping your parents and your own family, angrily replied the girl. You can go to them on weekends and the rest of the time. Cool. You came up with my girl's idea. Robert applauded. So, according to you, I don't have to rest at all. I have to limit helping my parents to work for you, not for me. Camille corrected him. I make my own money. Only I have to support you, for some reason. A mature, fully capable man. I understand, said the groom insultingly, that you are from an orphanage, and you have no idea that normal people consider it their duty to help their parents. Well, I'll explain it to you on my fingers. Parents raise their children, teach them to eat with a spoon, talk, go potty, and take care of them. And when the children grow up, it's their duty to help their parents. Don't you owe your family anything? Asked the girl. Nothing at all. Then what for? Do you have to live with someone? Live with your parents and pay off all your debts. Robert obviously sensed that his fiancée was on the verge of pointing the door at him. In the evening, he came with flowers and her favorite strawberry cake, and he tried to be kind and caring. Camille, who did not like scandals, decided not to remind him that the flowers and cake were bought with her money. Understand me correctly, asked the groom. This house that I am helping to build, it's for you and me too. That's where we're taking our kids for the summer. And then, it's not nice to say this, but this house is also our inheritance, sooner or later. He sounded convincing, but Camille sensed there was something else going on. Only the groom doesn't want to say what it is. All right, she said, so be it. But tell me, why should I? Look, life is unpredictable. You have to understand that. Anything can happen, like a brick falling on your head. Or are you and I going to go our separate ways? And in that case, I personally have nothing to count on. But I have to pinch myself to save money, to figure out how the two of us can live on one paycheck. And frankly speaking, Robert, I don't see any bonuses for myself in this situation. Because you're an orphan. He jumped up. His voice rose dangerously high, a sign of a fight to come. I shouldn't have tried to explain, Camille thought. He had one answer for everything. You don't understand what family is. He waved his hand. And what's there to talk about? That night, he went to spend the night at his parents' house. But the next morning, as if nothing had happened, he came back. But Camille was not concerned about him. She had been informed that she had a relative, and she had to go to the hospice, talk to the doctors and her grandmother. And then she came home. And there Robert was there again. And the claims again. Again, as always, Emily's photo album. It was all very trivial. A few old postcards with views of unknown cities, though not signed. Apparently, either the grandmother herself or her late husband were into collecting such souvenirs. There were also many pictures of family life, a large fringed chandelier above a round table with a samovar on it. A few people were sitting, and the hostess was pouring tea. That must be Emily. Camille noted that her grandmother's dress was perfectly tailored, with a motley shawl over her shoulders. The girl also noticed that her grandmother's hair was fashionably trimmed to her chin and styled in large waves. The dark color of her smiling lips betrayed the presence of lipstick. She was an interesting sort of Marlene Dietrich. The other two women. Apparently, the guests looked far from exquisitely loose, dressed in plain-colored dresses with the sleeves cut off. Their hair was simply pinned at the back of their heads. No makeup, no manicure. Ordinary women of the time. And here's a picture of Grandma and Grandpa at a resort somewhere. Emily is standing next to her husband in front of a tropical garden. The huge leaves of the palm trees are so heavy that it is not clear how the slender, elegant trunks can support them, how they do not break under the weight of these giant canopies. Emily stands leaning against the trunk. The dress she's wearing is something special again. However, after a closer look, Camille realized that it is most likely an ordinary beach robe. Only it was embroidered so that it looked more like a sundress. Double narrow straps on the shoulders. The skirt is slightly pinned, and the belt is wide white with a small buckle. And those were the post-war years. Suddenly, thought Camille, harder. I wonder how my grandmother managed to dress so well in those years. There were a few general shots, apparently with acquaintances from the sanatorium. Once again, Emily appeared among them as some kind of peculiar moth with narrow wings. It was hard to say what made her so different from the others. It wasn't just the fancy clothes. It was the way she held herself, smiled, turned her head. Everything was different, different from here. And flipping through the albums, page after page, Camille remembered again and again the doctor at her grandmother's hospice. Christopher had seen all those pictures too. And if he had, he couldn't help but notice how different Emily was from the others. And what would such an obviously show-off loving person have? There were no pictures of her former premarital life. Unbelievable. And if you add to that the fact that in her dreams she speaks German and refers to someone unknown by the name of John, what you wouldn't want to be interested in the mysteries of this mysterious lady's past. What kind of grandmother are you? Camille asked. At the picture. The woman in it, of course, answered nothing. Only the corners of her lips were raised in a slight smile, and her eyes, luminous to translucent, were looking slyly out of the picture. The girl was already looking forward to the day when she could visit her relative again. She had too many questions piled up, and she couldn't wait to ask them. Who knows, maybe her grandmother had asked Camille to pick up her albums. She wanted to let her see the pictures and decide for herself what she was interested in. Yes, the old lady had already proved that she was not as simple as she might have seemed at first sight. "What are you looking at?" Robert asked. Camille shuddered and could barely keep herself from bursting into tears. Immediately, she slammed the album shut. "I didn't hear you come up," she said. "It's work. I got an assignment. They asked me to digitize and try to retouch." It was a great excuse. Camille had been working in a big studio for a year and had been asked to clean up. The old photos were not new. She still didn't want to tell her fiancé the truth. Robert took the album from her hands and thumbed through it. "A beautiful woman," he said. He poked his finger at the pictures of Emily. It was strange. She looked so atypical. I remember my grandmother's pictures. Back then, it was considered beautiful if a woman in the body was so chubby to be. My grandmother used to say that if you went on vacation, it was considered good if you came back fat. And this is such a slender, though without the thinness is too slender for that time. She was not a foreigner. By any chance? I don't know. The girl tried to make her voice sound as natural as possible. "Why do you think so?" Well, the groom thought. For one thing, she's some kind of out-of-the-way hair figure and dressed in such an unusual way with makeup and well-groomed hands. Camille shrugged her shoulders. Maybe she had a job like that, something from the art world or a mannequin. Maybe, Robert agreed. And these pictures, where would they have come from? It was a girl looking closer. "I think they're just postcards with different views. Nothing special." And here Robert smiled victoriously. "You're wrong. My great-grandfather had one just like it. This is the flower store, only from a different angle. But that's the one I remember the name of. And this sign, it's all right here, and in the other picture the right side is burned, and the windows haven't been covered with bombing tape. That's for sure. Berlin and this street in its eastern part. I don't remember the name. Yeah, I guess things are different there now. And this is the same house where the flower store was taken down. And on the other side, see, that's the window with the flower boxes in the picture. Great-grandfather's. That window's gone. Must have been blown out by the blast. And the boxes are gone. But the iron supports for them are still there. And the flower boxes are down in front of the house, all glassed in. Even I remember this picture well. My great-grandfather said that's where he caught a piece of shrapnel in his shoulder. He knew that store, too. There afterwards he was laid with the wound. Our people made a hospital, I think. This place was convenient, plenty of room, and the waterworks worked. The owner told me that his brother used to have a store there, but he was a communist. And at the beginning of the war, he was thrown into a concentration camp. I think he didn't make it to the end. His wife was sent with him too. Yes, I'm not mistaken. Most likely this was taken right before the war. Or was it still intact in the early years? Robert shook his head and returned the album to Camille. My great-grandfather used to say how we went into Berlin, and there was so much hunger, cold, fear, children, hungry, ragged. He said he went through the whole of Europe and thought they would be met by the devil with horns in Berlin. But it turned out there were people there too. And for some reason that was the hardest thing to accept. My great-grandfather said he and his comrades tried to help them. Who wanted a piece of bread? Who just felt sorry for them or accompanied them to their parents? The children were not to blame, were they? He said that it was only then that he understood that the Germans were people too. And not all of them were bastards. And it is cold. They can be hungry, and they have children. And how many there were who cursed and hated that war. Scary all this, Camille looked at her fiancé in surprise. Never before had she thought that this subject could agitate him. And here in the picture it sure did. Berlin. Robert continued, as if awakened from his memories. I'd wonder if any of the family had been to Germany before the war. Or maybe she had. He found pictures of Emily again. Maybe she was a foreigner after all. Yes, Camille said, taking the album from him. Interesting. Before she went to her grandmother's house on the appointed day, she stopped by the bakery and picked up a bag full of assorted goodies for the old lady. Emily greeted her with a smile. The treats made her indescribably happy. At last, she had human food. She was overjoyed and smelled the fragrant bun with pleasure. I had given up hope of ever tasting anything like it again. Why, Grandma? Is the food here not good for you? Camille asked cautiously. Like the last time, she carried the old woman on a gurney away from public view, and only there handed her a bag of cakes. Emily, in her own inimitable way, dismissively threw. Don't forget that I'm considered a senile old woman here who can't remember how to chew. And what do they feed them? Mashed potatoes, carrots, zucchini, meat, rabbit food. I'll bring you something nice every time. Camille smiled. She was pleased that she was able to please the old lady, and now she watched with pleasure as she dealt with the buns. Tell me, why do you pretend in front of the doctors? It's part of my plan. Emily said, without stopping to chew. If I give up the comedy, they'll kill me with their questions. Have you seen our doctor? He sleeps and sees what he can sniff out, but he's understandable. Grandma, remarked the girl, when I flipped through your album, and I had questions. It's possible that only you have a simple curiosity. What about this one? She waggled her fist in the direction of the cores, just thinking how to stuff his pockets. Thinks he's struck gold. He'll get away with it. What are you talking about? The girl's confused. What gold mine? What's the matter with you? Of course, the thought crept into her head that maybe the old lady was thinking, but some kind of change in the psyche had already begun. This suspiciousness of hers. But what is she talking about? What can I take from her? She even had her apartment taken away by crooks. In fact, she's a pauper. Well, you know, in her time, Emily brushed off that can keep her mouth shut, but he won't hold his tongue for long. And you asked Camille softly, are you ready for a rant? You have also kept your mouth shut for a long time, haven't you? I'm told a man accidentally saw your photo album and told me that the postcards with the views are really photographs. And they were taken in Berlin, probably before the war. At the beginning of the war, the old lady dryly corrected. John got them for me, so I wouldn't be so homesick. So this flower store and home. I was born there the same colorless, Emily answered in a voice. I was named Jenna. That was my name until I was 19. That was afterwards. Then things change. My father owned a flower store. That way he didn't even have to go outside to be at work in the picture. Our apartment was behind the back door of the store. I grew up among flowers and loved to draw them in this little notebook my dad gave me. I'd never seen anyone else like it. We lived pretty modestly. Though Dad never explicitly said so, he didn't approve of excessive luxury and thought it was necessary to share with others. Every day he counted his daily receipts. He set aside a small part of it, and at the end of the month he made a donation to the orphanage. Mom didn't like it too much, but she never crossed her father on the matter. She probably respected him for his kindness, after all. True, that kindness did not save him. At the beginning of '44, my father was arrested as a communist, and a week later my mother was arrested. I never saw my parents again. And they didn't touch you. Camille surprised me. They didn't find me, the old woman answered reluctantly. Friends of my family were respectable people, and their position in Germany was considered safe and stable. They risked everything and hid me in their attic. There I lived for a week, fearing every rustle. My food was brought to me in the evening after dark, and not even a candle could be lit to see where the spoon and the plate were. I ate in complete darkness, and then the owner would take the dirty dishes downstairs. Besides him, there was a wife in the house who knew everything and helped her husband hide me. And their 10-year-old daughter didn't know anything, of course, but my parents were watching day and night to make sure the little girl didn't go into the attic for anything. I think they even made up some story that the floorboards in the attic were rotten and could fall through at any time if you don't know where to step. Then one day the father of the family came up to me. He cried and hugged me. I thought, he's got 2 sons at the front. Maybe someone had been killed. I asked him what was wrong. And then he admitted that he couldn't hide me anymore. But the next day, his son was to come for a visit. That's what he told me. And they would try to figure out what to do together. At that time, I thought he was crying with shame that he couldn't hide me any longer. But now I know that he was crying out of fear. The only person he could turn to for help was his son, a soldier who had shed blood at the front. Who knows what he would do when he learned that his own father was hiding the daughter of enemies of the Great Reich in the attic? Who knows what a man who has been brainwashed by propaganda for years will do? And in the morning I heard a knock on the door on the first floor. It was John arriving. The girl guessed. John. The old woman confirmed. I was scared. No one must have come upstairs for an hour or 2. I waited every minute for the door to swing open and to see a ferocious soldier with a gun in his hands on the doorstep. I waited for him to shout, "Heil, Hitler," and pull the trigger. I was so scared, I even began to think of a way to get out of here without being seen. There was a round window in my attic, and I could get to the roof through it, and then go down the fire escape. The only difficulty was that the window was very close to the edge of the roof. There was only a hand's width of space, and the slightest mistake could have been fatal. It was daytime, and there were people walking up and down the street. I was sure to be seen. It didn't matter that they had no idea who I was. After all, a girl had climbed out on the roof through the attic window in broad daylight, walking toward the fire escape. It didn't take a genius to guess that the girl was hiding from someone. I heard muffled voices downstairs. The master's office was just below my hiding place, and I lay on the floor, hoping to hear some of their conversation. But I couldn't make it out. Time passed, and I was still afraid to move, afraid to remind myself. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but I guessed from the way it was getting darker in the attic that it was evening, and the soft voices downstairs were still there. And I was terribly tired of lying motionless. Even the blood seemed to run slower through my veins, and there were fewer and fewer thoughts in my head. The immobility was killing me. In the end, I just fell asleep. I woke up. I must have been in the middle of the night, because the door opened, and my landlord came in through the smell that filled the room. I guessed he had brought me food, but it wasn't him. Don't be afraid to hear me. I am a whisperer in the dark. I brought you food. My name is John. I never saw his face that night, but he was sitting next to me, while I ate and told me how they planned to get me out of Berlin. He said he had a friend in a village near the city, and I could live on his farm as a hired laborer without attracting any attention. Early tomorrow morning, he said, Kevin will come here, as if to pick me up. We'll pretend we're going fishing, and we'll sneak you out of the house in the car, hide you under the tent. For some reason, I listened to him with a kind of indifference. I must have been so exhausted from the day that I couldn't feel anything at all. And besides, I was so hungry. I wanted to eat so badly that I didn't care what this John guy said. Maybe he figured it out, because as soon as I got there, he took my plate and left, wishing me a good night's sleep. Then Kevin arrived in the morning. The time was early, maybe 4 o'clock. They took me out. Before any of the neighbors woke up, I had to lie on the floor, on the back seat of the car, and they threw a tent on top of me. Of course, it was terribly uncomfortable to lie down, and the tent was heavy, but there was no other way. Besides, all my thoughts were on the imminent danger. There were patrols outside the town, and any one of them could have searched the car. The guys were singing loudly, laughing a lot. I think they were making noise on purpose. Maybe they even hoped to wake someone up. They did it so that no one would have any doubts. They were really going to the village to fish. I still remember the second the car started. It felt like an earthquake had started. It wasn't because the car was vibrating. It's just that at that very moment, I realized that I had set out on a new path that could lead to a new life or to death, and no one could give me any guarantees. No one could tell me what to do. There was the unknown ahead of me. I moved into it like a thick fog, simply because I couldn't stay where I was. The old woman was silent. Her eyes became moist, and Camille didn't know whether they were tears from old age or from memory. "Maybe you're tired, Grandma," she asked. "Do you want to go back?" "I don't want to." Then Emily frowned angrily. "I'm not trying so hard that I can't tell a story from beginning to end." She wiped her eyes with her handkerchief and continued in a different voice. I realize now that I was thinking mostly of myself. But how could it be different when you're so scared? The boys, John and Kevin, seemed so strong and sure of themselves. It wasn't until later that I realized they were just as scared as I was. I dreaded to think what would have been done to them if the whole thing had come out, and what would have happened to John's parents. Yes, they risked just as much, maybe more. I didn't have a choice to stay or go to Kevin's farm. They had a choice. It wouldn't have cost the boys anything to refuse to help me, and no one would have judged them for it. But they still had the courage to save themselves. A girl no one wanted, and yet they put on this show with songs and pretentious fun. Kevin took us a special way. He drove through town because he knew there was an outpost on the west side of town. And today his old acquaintances, who never searched their own, would be on guard duty. And this time he was lucky too. We left Berlin unhindered. I guess I should have been happy about that, but it was like I was all petrified from the experience at Kevin's farm was very good. The war wasn't felt here. People were going about their business. The ducks were quacking. There was such peace and tranquility that one could not believe that Berlin, with its despair, with the sound of breaking glass, with arrests and fear, was so near. The whole city was saturated with it. It seemed that even the walls of the houses were ringing with unbearable tension. It was so peaceful here. Kevin and John told me what they had come up with during those years. Many Soviet citizens were taken to Germany for forced labor. The Germans called them Gastarbeiters, that is, workers from the East. In this situation, it was easiest to pass me off as a woman from the Soviet Union, which Kevin chose to work on the farm. Just in case, the guys decided to tell everyone that I was deaf and dumb. There was one last difficulty. All the guest workers had work cards with their picture, name, and surname on them. In short, it was a document that had to be obtained for me. John promised to take care of it. Kevin gave me a room on the first floor of the house next to the kitchen. It was always warm. His old man, his father, lived on the farm besides him, and there was no one else there. My older brother Kevin had laid down his head somewhere in Poland, and my mother couldn't survive the death of her eldest son. She died a week after receiving the news that her beloved son was no longer alive. Kevin said her biggest worry was that she couldn't bury her son the way she was supposed to, but there was nothing to bury. He had been bombed, and what was left of him was unrecognizable. It was said that he was buried in a mass grave with the others. The old man seemed to retain his sanity, but became very withdrawn. All day long he would sit in the sun and scold some wood. When he saw me, he asked his son a single question. "No, she is Russian," Kevin answered. And my father did not ask him any more questions. He didn't seem to notice me at all. He didn't notice anything at all, except his wood. At least, he didn't want to notice. The old man was like a snail that sleeps in its shell and only comes out when someone gets the worst of it. Kevin carried the whole farm alone, and it wasn't a small farm. An orchard, a huge vegetable garden, and there were goats, cows, rabbits, a few horses, and 5 piglets, ducks, chickens, which also had to be taken care of. I think Kevin was embarrassed to burden me with work, but he knew what the countryside was all about, whether it was the same in a German village or in a Russian village. Rumors spread fast. You can't hide anything there. If someone notices that the worker is lazy, then very soon knows all. And then there's no question and no gossip. But Kevin always chose an easier job for me. collecting eggs from under the chickens to feed the birds, rabbits, picking herbs. Even to the well for water, he always went by himself. Some neighbors bluntly said it was obvious he took a worker to the farm so he could do the hardest dirty work for her himself. Kevin always told them that there were men for men's work. They soon got rid of him with these inquiries. Apparently, his calm confidence had a sobering effect on them. John stayed overnight the first day and then went back to town. I hardly spoke to him and didn't see much of him. He and Kevin had actually gone fishing, obviously for the sake of full believability. So we didn't see each other until late that night for dinner. We had fried pike and boiled potatoes that evening. The old man went to bed early, and John and Kevin and I decided to eat in the kitchen. That was the first time I got a real look at him. He was handsome, yes. Camille asked curiously. The old lady sighed. Too handsome. He was, as they said back then, a real blonde beast, fair-skinned with expressive blue eyes. His hair was no lighter than linen, twisted in large rings. He was tall and broad-shouldered. One would have expected a heavy gait and movement from such a large man, but there was nothing of the sort. He moved easily and smoothly, like a gymnast. Afterwards, I learned that John had taken up gymnastics at his mother's insistence, ever since he started walking. He was born, after all, premature. He didn't take the breast because he didn't have the strength to suckle milk. His parents feared for his life the entire first year. That is why, when he survived, they tried to do everything to make sure the boy grew up healthy and strong, and they succeeded. I looked at him, and it was hard for me to believe that such beauty could exist on this earth at all. Or maybe it was because I hadn't seen beautiful people in a long time. It was the summer of '44. At that time, it was clear to everyone that Germany would not win the war. No one believed the propaganda from the goddamn masturbators. Camille woke up when she heard her grandmother say such a vulgar word, but Emily paid no attention to it. The cursed masturbators repeatedly screamed about how Hitler's victorious troops were marching across Europe, bringing peace and order everywhere, cleansing the land of communists who were taking the bread of honest toilers. It was said that the success of the enemies was pure fabrication. But at that time in Germany no longer believed the propagandists with their shouting. Everyone understood that the end of the war was near. And as always, in such cases it would be bad for ordinary people. The Germans, who toiled on their farms, still hoped that the land could feed them. But the townspeople were desperate, their faces grim with tightly pressed lips. Their foreheads were wrinkled early and the depths of their eyes hidden, languishing like a pike at the bottom of a river. Fear, and even those who were naturally beautiful soon turned into gray, haggard, aged people, while John sat across the table from me, smiling so nonchalantly, as if he knew nothing of any war. Not to mention the proximity of defeat. Both he and Kevin, they suddenly seemed to me just boys escaping the meat grinder from class, like they were running to the movies, and they spent their pocket money on a bag of lollipop mix, and they rejoice in this unexpected freedom. The realization that they have broken school rules fills them with a sense of their own audacity of power. I don't think I've ever loved anyone else as much as I love them both at this moment of never and no one else. The next day John left, and I suddenly realized how attached I had become to him in such a short time. Kevin stayed close by, but all the time it felt like he was next to me. And there was something very, very important missing from this farm. And that important thing was John. Everything felt like it was missing. He was missing. And so was Kevin. A laughing whistle. When he called the watchdog to him. The way he sang at the top of his voice while chopping wood. By the way, John sang. It was awful. I don't think I've ever heard anybody sing that awful. But I missed even his fake singing. Kevin and I didn't talk about it, of course, but we met several times that day. And I got the same look in his eyes every time. He was bored, too, and feeling a little lost. A few days passed, and John arrived at the farm again. This time he brought fake documents in the name of Emily, a native of Belarus. It was late in the evening. John came into my room and handed me my work card. That's your real name now, he told me then. Forget it. You're not Jenna. You're Emily. And you don't understand a word of German. Where did you find my picture? I asked. And why did I get the picture from my father? He said. And there's more. He took out of his pocket 2 more pictures, the ones of my father's flower store. And I got those from him too. So you can go back to your house sometimes, at least in my memories. And I could never go back there again. I asked him. Never be able to be Jenna again. John went silent. He looked me in the eye and shook his head. Never. I suddenly realized this with such terrible clarity. Jenna no longer existed, and she would never come back. She's gone, maybe dead, but she and I are now, and forever, different people. I am Emily. My homeland is Belarus. And from there, the Germans drove me out to work for the Great Germany. And that means no my father, no mother, no flower store, where my childhood was spent. I never received that miniature notebook as a gift. I didn't draw flowers in it. There was no Christmas of my mother's apple pies, no lullabies my father sang to me. I would never again utter a word in German. I will never sing my children a lullaby in the language of my childhood. John must have felt the same way I did. He covered my hand with his big palm and made me clench my fist. You have to live, he said quietly. Even if you don't know how, just grit your teeth and live day by day. And one day you'll realize that you've come out on the hard road. The war took my family away from me. With bitterness, I said, my language, and now my past. I have nothing left. There is you, he said, and hugged me tightly. I tucked my shirt into his chest, smelling of tobacco. And then I greedily inhaled that smell, because it was the smell of a living thing. John was alive, and that was so important to me, because I felt dead. John stayed still. His leave was ending for 2 days, and he wanted to have plenty of time to swim in the river, to fish. Kevin was happy about it, and so was I. Even Kevin's old dad seemed to come alive a little, looking out of his shell. One day I even heard him humming his timeless wood. One day, out of the blue, he smiled cheerfully at me. And it was so surprising. I didn't know he could smile at all. John was like warm sunshine. Everyone in his presence kind of melted away. And it seemed like as long as he was around, no trouble could happen. The boys used to take me to the river. As a diversion, we took a couple of horses with us, and I pretended to bathe them in the river. But really it was just the 3 of us splashing around. And then the boys would roast a little shirt on the fire, and we'd eat it with baked potatoes instead of dinner. Kevin had several bottles of cherry liquor in the cellar. His mother used to make it, and we'd drink it sitting around the fire. And I'd catch John looking at me. He looked at me like he'd never seen me before. And that was partly true. He saw me frightened, depressed, afraid of everything, confused, miserable. But just as I'd been at the fire, calm, cheerful, smiling, he never saw me. And I must have been good. There was plenty of food at Kevin's farm, and no one forbade it. I had plenty to eat. There was milk and eggs and butter. And of course, lots of vegetables and meat. Things were a little worse, but there was that too. After Berlin, it seemed to me an incredible luxury. John's parents shared with me what they ate themselves, but the food was so expensive, they never had enough themselves. During my time in the village, I got a little rounder, no longer looking as haggard as I used to. My hair used to fall out in shreds, and now it's thick again. I got my healthy shine back. I even got a blush from the fresh air. John was definitely getting to know me all over again. I couldn't believe he was looking at me with such interest, the way a man looks at a woman he likes. Of course, I didn't have much experience in these matters. I learned something from my friends, and once a neighbor's boy blew me a couple of kisses. That was it. But I felt John liked me. And I was afraid to believe it, because if he suddenly took his eyes off me, I would feel rejected. The girl prompted, yes, but he didn't take his eyes off me. And as we walked back to the farm in the dark, I could feel him walking beside me. I could feel his warmth. He was leading the horse with one hand, and the other was very light and careful around my waist, and I could hardly keep from really snuggling up to him. We walked like this through the darkness of the night and the silence, and I suddenly imagined that John and I had been married for a long time and were at home sleeping in our beds, our children and there was never any war or grief or fear. We would come home, young and happy, used to living hard and knowing firmly that only our future depends on ourselves. That's what I thought and almost believed in my fantasy at the time. Maybe in some other life it was. And when we got home, before I went to bed, I brushed my hair particularly carefully and didn't braid it. As usual, I plucked my cheeks and lips a little to make my blush brighter, carefully fluffed my pillow, and left the candle burning. I waited for John. He just couldn't not come to me after all that magical evening. And he came, of course, at a different time. No romance could have progressed at that speed. But then neither of us knew what would happen tomorrow or in a week. No one knew if we would live to see the end of the war. And we loved each other here and now without thinking about the future. We hurried to say all the tender words we could give each other, all the passion that could last a lifetime. We wanted to fit all of our love into one night, even though we knew that it wouldn't be enough anyway. But at least we had that one night, and it belonged to us. We snatched it from this war, from this uncertainty, and by and large from death itself. In the morning I woke up. John had gotten up early and had already left for Berlin. I woke up and saw that before he left he had wrapped me in a blanket and left me a note promising that he would definitely write from the front. I felt so happy, so devastated, that I sat on the bed for a long time, twirling his note in my hands. "Did you ever get any letters from him?" Camille asked. Grandmother nodded twice. In them he wrote nothing about the war, but a lot about how much he loved me and how he hoped that someday he would be able to see me again. It turns out then, on the way to the farm, and he dreamed that one day he and I would get married, and then we could settle down in the village. Then we would have a house of our own, where we could live our whole lives and raise our children. I didn't know we were dreaming of the same thing. The last letter came in February of '45. Kevin's father had died by then, and we were alone. Kevin often went out in the evenings and always came back very late. I was afraid to spend the night alone in an empty house, so I didn't go to bed without waiting for him. One day he came back early, very pale. He was shivering like he had a fever, and these big drops of sweat on his forehead. I knew at once that something had happened to John, and it turned out I was not mistaken. He had been killed at the front. Camille asked. No, the old woman's voice lost all color and became dry and unemotional again. He was shot by his own men as a traitor. John, as it turned out, had been connected with the resistance fighters from the very beginning of the war. But for the time being he was lucky, and no one suspected him of anything. He was too convincing. He was in the role of a true Aryan. But at the very end of the war his luck ran out. Kevin, as you understand, also took part in the resistance and learned from his own people that John was gone. That was at the end of April '45. In May it was over. I was to be sent back to my homeland as a forcibly displaced person. In July I got off the train in Minsk, alone in a foreign country with false documents. But it was such a mess then. How many were there? Tired, hungry, without documents. I was quickly issued a passport and was advised to forget about the fact that I was in Germany. I lived in Minsk for a month in some school that had been converted into a dormitory, and then I left for Moscow. Got a job as a designer in a theater, and got a room in a communal apartment next to the theater. I still pretended to be deaf and dumb, but in fact I listened and absorbed Russian speech all the time, repeating Russian words at night. And when I started talking, the doctors decided that my dumbness was the result of shock and some severe shock related to the war. So no one paid any attention to the fact that I still mangled my words. Eventually I got rid of the accent, and quite quickly, and I even learned Russian so well that no one suspected me of being German. I didn't remember much about John at the time. There was too much fuss going on around me. But a year later, when my life had more or less settled down, I suddenly realized he was gone. And it was so irrevocable. I realized that even after many years, I would never meet him anywhere. That both he and our love was the past, and that it had ended with my lover's life. I wanted to write to Kevin to ask him how he was living now. I wanted to ask him if he knew where John was buried, and if his parents and older brother were still alive. But I was afraid all the time, afraid to give myself away. Later, I met my husband, Stephen. By that time, I had already worked in the studio, became a costume designer. Stephen fell in love with me immediately, and I must say, I did not have special feelings for him. But he was so nice, attentive, so reverent to me that I just had no reason to refuse him. And besides, it was because of me that he stopped communicating with his brother, who didn't like me. He didn't want Stephen to marry me. It ended in a fight, and the brothers never spoke to each other again or even met. And me, I got used to my husband, and I guess I learned to love him in my own way. I didn't have children, though, but neither he nor I particularly wanted to be parents. Stephen was too much into his work. He was a scientist. What about me? The only man I ever wanted to have children with was taken from me by the war. That's the whole story. But there's something you didn't tell me. My grandmother reminded me of Camille, who is the mysterious benefactor who put you here and pays for your stay. It is Kevin's son. The old lady answered without thinking. When Kevin married, he named his firstborn son John after his best friend. And when he died, he willed his son to track me down and take care of me. He has to do it anonymously because our head doctor hopes he can blackmail him through me. I don't think he's counting on that, though. Now I guess I'm really tired. Take me back to my room. I want to lie down. Camille was on her way out when she was intercepted by Christopher. I see, he said, smiling, that you have managed to get along with your relative. You, walking in the park, and after your visits she sleeps very soundly. The girl shrugged her shoulders. You know her condition. Maybe she just likes the idea of someone visiting her. She must be feeling something. Did you find out anything about her past? He asked quickly. His gaze changed subtly from complacent to benevolent. It had become supple, very businesslike. I managed. My grandmother, who was born in Minsk, smiled. After the war, she moved to Moscow and at first painted scenery in the theater. Later, she became a costume designer. Then she got married. Sorry to disappoint you, but there's nothing remarkable in her biography. A secret benefactor, the doctor frowned. Do you know who he is? What is his name? I have no idea. Camille was insolently offended. Now if you'll excuse me. Christopher, I have to go. Robert, as usual, was in a bad mood. Have you disappeared? There is no food ready in the house, he said pitifully. So cook something tiredly, Camille answered. How hard can it be to fry an egg? Actually, it's cold, said the groom. A normal woman feeds her men something more substantial than eggs, especially if those men work somewhere and support a family instantly, she parried. And if they invest all their time and energy building for their parents, let their parents feed them. I always knew you'd never understand anything about family, he hissed. Orphan, what do you know about family help? What do you understand about it? Yes, I have and will continue to invest in this house of theirs. And you know why? Because if anything, if you and I split up, I'm going to go live there. And we probably will, because you don't know simple things about parents and kids and family ties. What kind of family can you have with you? So I'm building this house for me too. It's my escape route. Then Camille, smiling, put her bag on the table. I think it's time to use it. Robert leaned forward out of surprise. What did you say? I said get out, firmly said Camille. And suddenly she felt such joy, as if she had been given her long-awaited freedom. And it was really so. How long she had wanted to say these very words. It was true what her grandmother had said. What burden? The impossibility of telling the truth. The girl's eyes shone with joy and relief. It was about time she left. Robert muttered and went to gather his things. I have put up with you long enough. Camille slept soundly like a baby that night. That's why she wasn't immediately awakened by the phone call. Emily had passed away 20 minutes ago, she was informed. She died quietly and peacefully in her sleep. Try to come tomorrow, preferably right in the morning. I will come, the girl promised. I'll be there. Camille passed out and sat on the bed for a long time. Looking at herself, it seemed to her that she could see before her a night field in which John and Jenna, young and beautiful again, were walking in embrace. And now they had an eternity ahead of them, never to be parted. 6 months later, Camille opened the door without thinking, without even asking who was there. Camille was taken aback when she saw a strange man in a dark suit on the threshold. Are you sure you're here to see me? She asked in surprise. Good morning, Camille. The stranger smiled modestly. I have come to speak to you about the inheritance. What inheritance? I know nothing of the inheritance you are to receive from your relative Emily, who passed away 6 months ago. May I come in? I will, of course. Camille mechanically tucked her robe tighter around her chest. Come in. Will you sit here on the sofa, or shall we go into the kitchen? The sofa is all right, the man answered, and took a thick folder out of his briefcase. Your relative Emily has lost her home as a result of fraudulent schemes. As you undoubtedly already know, I know. Well, it turned out she had friends in Germany who, upon learning of her misfortune, paid extra for her boarding house accommodation. But not only that. Apparently, to comfort the old lady, her friends bought for her a mansion a few kilometers from Moscow, 3 floors of land, and of course, a wonderful fresh air. A friend of your great-aunt's great-aunt? Yes, that's right. Great-aunt. Mr. Kevin left a will saying that this house and everything in it belongs to Emily, and in case she doesn't live to inherit, everything goes to you, Camille, as her only relative. All you have to do is sign the papers, and then the mansion is yours. Thank you, muttered Camille, still unable to believe what she had just heard. The phone in her pocket. It vibrated long and particularly wistful. Robert, I'm sorry. I'll answer it. The girl apologized. Yes, of course, Camille. Robert's voice was panting and enriched at once with 1,000 pitying tones. Camille, a misfortune happened to our parents. The house burned to the ground tonight. Everyone is unharmed. She asked. Alarmed. Yes, but now we have absolutely nowhere to live. Camille, please let me stay here. My parents are staying with my aunt and I. I'm sorry, Robert. Camille interrupted him. I can't help you. She dropped the bell and went back into the room. So where were we? An inheritance, you say? Yes. All of a sudden, a smiling old woman with an unusual fate appeared before Camille's eyes, and at the same moment disappeared like a night moth.